Hello and welcome to the final video of our GUI screencast series. When we left off in the last video, we had an app that was working. So when we move around our RGB color bars, our sliders, it actually is giving us a nice color in RGB color space down the bottom. So in this video, I just wanted to show you a few polishing touches, finishing touches that you can put on this to make it just that little bit nicer. So the first thing I want to look at is this startup behavior. So right at the start, we created this panel that was hot pink and had sort of some initial positions for the sliders. However, those slider positions don't actually match up with the color that's showing down the bottom. So if I was to just sort of move that green out and back in, what the actual color should have been was this kind of mucky browny red color, which was not what we had. So what we can do is we can actually set that up to run at start. And there's a few ways that we could approach this, but I'm going to show you a way that I think is quite nice in terms of the neatness of the code. So it's going to involve a little bit of refactoring, a couple of steps, but just try to follow along with me. So we're going to go back over into our code view. Now, to run something at the start before the actual thing opens up for the user to see, we can actually create a startup function. So inside the actual overall app inspector, we can see that there's a callback available called startup function. So you want to create that, click on that overall app's name and then navigate to callbacks and see that startup function option. I like to call it onstart. That's kind of old notation from previous versions of MATLAB, but I think it makes sense. It's the first thing to run after everything's created, so it's onstart. So hit enter there and it will generate that. Now, we've already written some code that will synchronize the color with the position of the bars. So in line with the whole don't repeat yourself principle of programming, what we really want to do is reference this. However, the challenge lies in the fact that the update color thing requires an app and an event. We're not actually generating an event here. So what we want to do is probably wrap this all up into a separate function again and have each of these reference that function. So how do we create a function that's not a callback? Well, on the left-hand side, we've got this code browser window that shows us our callbacks, our functions, and our properties. So properties, we could store some sort of data that the whole program needs to access. You might want to use that next in the lab. For functions, we can create functions that the callbacks might refer to, for example. So I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, I'm going to change this callback to slider moved because it's no longer going to update the color directly. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. I'm then going to create a new function that I'm going to call update color. So you might be able to see where this is going. I'm going to move the functionality of this here into this, and then I'm going to have each of these functions reference that synchronization code. So I'm going to take this chunk of code that we wrote earlier and move it up here. And then I'm going to update the slider moved function to actually call that. So it will call update color. I need to pass it the app itself. So just to check that everything's working before we go any further, I'm just going to run it again, open it up new, and check that we haven't broken our existing functionality. And you can see that that existing functionality still worked. So the chain of events here is I move the slider, it triggers the slider moved event, and that calls the update color function. So we've sort of just moved through a chain of execution there. So why are we doing it this way? The reason we're doing it this way is we can also fix that onStart functionality by calling that function from here. So if we call this function from here as well, then when I create a brand new instance, it actually synchronizes the color down the bottom with the values on the slider. Now, this red color is perhaps not the most attractive color on Earth, so we could also change what those default positions are a little bit to make it a bit prettier. So we could go back to our blue slider and we could change its initial position. Maybe we want to make something that's a little bit purple, so we might want to change its value to 0.5. And you can play around with that until you actually have a color there that you like. So I don't mind that. I'm happy to leave it there. So that's one way that you can actually get around the any issues on startup, you can create that onstart function and it will run before the actual thing appears to the user. So that's a very handy thing to know, and it can be quite helpful for your lab this week as well. And that function creation process will also be helpful for your lab next week, because you'll be provided with a function that converts HSV color space to RGB color space, and you'll need to actually place that somewhere. And that function process is what you will use to do it. So hopefully each of those techniques is helpful when you're going into your lab next week. If there's any questions, feel free to ask them, but otherwise we might leave it here. I hope you've enjoyed the GUI screencast series, and I'll see you in class.